Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I am doing a solo episode where I unpack scholarship. In particular, I am concluding a mini-series on Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So today's episode is going to unpack chapter 4. So if you haven't listened to my discussions on chapters 1, 2, and 3, I highly recommend starting there first, because this chapter synthesizes many of the understandings previously talked about, and in particular discusses a theoretical framework around creating dialogue as a leader. Now, before we get started, I want to say that even though this is the final episode of this mini-series, I do highly recommend you actually read through the book. There's a lot of nuances and examples and discussions in there that I simply cannot put into this podcast, because I'm just trying to quickly summarize some of the main points in relation to CS education. So as mentioned previously, especially in the discussion on chapter 3, Freire argues that human activity is comprised of both action and reflection that occur simultaneously. So we can't just have one without the other. So here's a quote from page 118. Quote, "Human activity consists of action and reflection. It is praxis. It is transformation of the world. And as praxis, it requires theory to illuminate it." End quote. So it's not enough to just reflect on theory without action, or to take action without having a guiding theory. We need to do both. So as I mentioned in chapter 3's podcast that came out 2 weeks ago, we need to, as educators, engage in critical reflection of the theories that inform that we are doing, as well as these social pressures or influences that are informing what we do in the classroom. For example, the learning theories, the specific standards, the administrators' rules or guidelines, etc. All of these things all inform what we do. And I argue, as well as Freire, that we need to actually critically reflect on these things and act upon them intentionally, not just blindly engaging in practices without reflecting on the why or the how. Now, as educational leaders, Freire makes a point that leaders cannot simply take responsibility for coordinating or even sometimes directing action. However, it's important as educators and leaders to clarify that leaders can take responsibility for coordinating or sometimes directing action. However, Freire points out that it is not through an imposition of values, ideas, ways of being on other people. Instead, the oppressed also need the opportunity to reflect on their actions. Otherwise, their actions can be a form of manipulation for gaining power for others. In other words, leaders cannot simply lead through domination of the oppressed. So if you're listening to this podcast and are like, cool, critical pedagogy sounds amazing, I want to engage in these liberatory practices, it's not okay for us to just all of a sudden go into the classroom, virtually or in person, and start saying, you need to do this, and you need to think this way, and you need to engage in critical reflection, etc. We actually have to engage in dialogical processes that we will talk about further in this episode, and that we talked about in the episode for chapter 3. One of the reasons why Freire points this out and wants to clarify this towards the start of this chapter is that he posits that it's not okay to carry out a revolution for a group of people, because doing so is equivalent to doing a revolution without the people. Quote, "To simply think about the people, as the dominators do, without any self-giving in that thought, to fail to think with the people, is a sure way to cease being revolutionary leaders." End quote. From page 124. So to engage in such dialogue, leaders, quote, "cannot believe in the myth of the ignorance of the people," end quote. Page 126. Nor can they sloganize the people. So instead, they, quote, "must enter into dialogue with them, so that the people's empirical knowledge of reality, nourished by the leaders' critical knowledge, gradually becomes transformed into knowledge of the causes of reality," end quote. From page 126. So, in other words, leaders need to engage in continuous and permanent dialogue from the onset of dismantling power structures. If we don't, then we are instead taking a position as oppressors, despite being well-intentioned. Okay, so a large portion of this particular chapter presents two opposing practices. One is anti-dialogical practices that are meant to maintain control, and the other are dialogical practices that are meant to liberate and humanize people. So the first part that we're going to unpack is the anti-dialogical practice. Anti-dialogical practices have four main characteristics that Freire mentions. One is conquest, the next is dividing and conquering, the next one is manipulating, and the last one is cultural invasion. So we're going to unpack each of these four. Then after that, I'm going to talk about dialogical practices and the different characteristics of that, which are the practices that Freire recommends as a critical pedagogy. Okay, so conquest. This particular characteristic of anti-dialogical practices is to conquer a group of people in order to maintain power through the control of another group of people. However, Freire notes that some who conquer will do so in a way that makes it appear as though they are giving up their power, when in reality their actions are really to maintain control. So as an example that was discussed, Romans would give bread and circus to people in order to, quote, soften them up. So even though they were conquering people and their ways of being and their ways of knowing or ways of viewing the world, so their epistemologies, axiologies, ontologies, if you want to use some fancy words, they were doing so in a way that made it seem like, oh, we're helping you, we're giving you food, we're giving you entertainment, as long as we maintain this form of control between oppressor and oppressed. Okay, so now let's talk about the second characteristic. So this one's going to be a little bit longer discussion. So this is on divide and conquer. Here's a quote from pages 131 to 132 that discusses this. Quote, "As the oppressor minority subordinates and dominates the majority, it must divide it and keep it divided in order to remain in power. The minority cannot permit itself the luxury of tolerating the unification of the people, which would undoubtedly signify a serious threat to their own hegemony. Accordingly, the minority cannot permit itself the luxury of tolerating the unification of the people, which would undoubtedly signify a serious threat to their own hegemony. Accordingly, the oppressors halt by any method, including violence, any action which in even incipient fashion could awaken the oppressed to the need for unity. Concepts such as unity, organization, and struggle are immediately labeled as dangerous. In fact, of course, these concepts are dangerous to the oppressors, for the realization is necessary to actions of liberation." End quote. So this particular section on dividing and conquering, again, this book was written in 1970, so 50 years ago, 50 years ago. This conversation is very relevant with what's going on right now in Black Lives Matter in 2020, as well as politics, as well as just how people are communicating with each other across these social divides that have widened over the last few years or even decades. One of the things that Freire notes as a tactic for dividing and conquering is that the oppressors further divide and conquering by distributing benefits and penalties that seek to preserve the current power structure. So as an example of what's going on with Black Lives Matter, some people are quoting and promoting a small number of black conservatives who condemn protests that turn violent while vilifying a person who peacefully takes a knee. So in other words, we are providing benefits to people who are saying violence is wrong, but we are penalizing people who are peacefully protesting the same topic. This, according to Freire, is a form of oppression and maintaining power and control over a group of individuals. Here's a quote from page 135. Quote, "Dividing in order to preserve the status quo, then, is necessarily a fundamental objective of the theory of anti-dialogical action. In addition, the dominators try to present themselves as saviors of the women and men they dehumanize and divide. This messianism, however, cannot conceal their true intention, to save themselves. They must save their riches, their power, their way of life, the things that enable them to subjugate others." End quote. From page 135. So another approach of oppressors is to divide while making it appear as though they are actually defending the oppressed. Now, as a contemporary example in 2020, politicians in recent years have been saying for quite some time now that they're here for the people and they want to help the oppressed. But then they end up passing laws that favor corporations and business owners over the individuals that they said they were going to protect. Now, one way that we as educators might be able to look at divide and conquer in relation to the classroom setting is think about how kids are divided and conquered, whether it be by grade level, whether it be between grade levels in terms of having several different classes for, let's say, third grade, or even within specific classes by dividing by the, quote, gifted, talented, or the kids who need more support. Although it allows us to work one-on-one with people, this is also still a form of dividing and conquering and othering of people. Yes, it provides support and services, but there are many ways of learning that involve learning across grade levels in terms of vertical learning, in terms of also learning across different levels of expertise and learning from each other. So the so-called gifted and talented kids can work alongside the kids who need extra support. So we don't necessarily have to divide and conquer. So Freire might argue that instead of having grade levels, instead of having these different groups, why don't we work across experiences, across grades, across ages, etc.? Having worked in settings like that, it works really well. But I also understand that this approach goes against what many people might be thinking right now of, yeah, but if I have all of the kids who are struggling on a topic in the same group, it's easier for me to work with them on that topic. Or if I have all the kids who are excelling in a topic on something, it's easier for me to work with them on that. My response to that might be, it's only easier if we were teaching to the average or to the mean, rather than teaching individuals and working alongside individuals. So that's my polite counterpoint to say that it is still a form of dividing and conquering if we are dividing up groups by abilities, ages, experience, etc. And I say that with love to everyone. I, too, am guilty of oppressing people, constantly reflecting on it, trying to work on it. So, not trying to point fingers or anything like that. Especially because this form of dividing and conquering is usually outside of the control of teachers. So, while I did not enjoy grade levels, the structure of the districts that I've worked in, at most, had 3 grade levels combined. That was a rare exception. Most of the classes were single grade level, by experience, etc. And that was out of my control as a single teacher. That would be more in the control of administration, superintendents, etc. Okay, so let's talk about the third characteristic of anti-dialogical practices. This characteristic is manipulation. So Freire argues that manipulation is done through a series of myths, such as, quote, the model of itself which of the bourgeoisie presents to the people as the possibility for their own assent. In order for the myths to function, however, the people must accept the world of the bourgeoisie. End quote. It's from page 136. So, in other words, the oppressors are presenting a model of the world and are giving paths for which people can ascend through that. But by ascending through it and vilifying and demonizing some people who do not follow the norms, and praising people who do follow the very specific view of the world, we are perpetuating these forms of oppression that I talked about in Chapter 2 and in Chapter 1. So as an example of this in the classroom, so manipulation could be something along the lines of rewarding certain ways of creating in computer science or through coding as a path for ascending in achieving a high grade in the class, or being able to work on more complicated, more interesting assignments, while also penalizing other ways of engaging in computer science or engaging in coding. So another approach for manipulating the oppressed is by giving unauthentic forms of organization that avoid questioning the status quo, but give a sense of power. So as an example of this, it might be like student forms of government. So we have a student president, student vice president, secretary, etc. But the tasks and responsibilities that we give to them avoid questioning the status quo of students in the school, but instead focus on menial things that maintain the power dynamics that are at play. Now, I could also argue that some of the interest-driven practices that I promote could be viewed as a form of manipulation. So, as an example of that, although students are able to choose projects and topics of interest that they can explore through computer science or coding, they are likely forced to participate in such practices and are unable to question such mandates. Among other reasons, this is one of the reasons why I am not actually a fan of mandatory subjects or classes, which I will talk about towards the end of this particular episode. So in other words, even though kids were able to create projects that were interesting to them, they were still required to create a project while engaging in coding practices in the classes that I facilitated. And the reason why is because that's what they received a grade for. And this was imposed upon me by administrators. So I had to give a grade. And it had to be for engaging in coding. I couldn't just say, oh, this kid's a great basketball player, so therefore A+. Okay, so the last characteristic of anti-dialogical action is cultural invasion. which is when, quote, the invaders penetrate the cultural context of another group, in disrespect of the latter's potentiality. They impose their own view of the world upon those they invade and inhibit the creativity of the invaded by curbing their expression, end quote, from page 141. Here's another quote from page 148 that further clarifies what cultural invasion is. Quote, cultural invasion, which serves the ends of conquest and the preservation of oppression, always involves a parochial view of reality, a static perception of the world, and the imposition of one worldview upon another. It implies the superiority of the invader and the inferiority of those who are invaded, as well as the imposition of values by the former, who possesses the latter and are afraid of losing them. Cultural invasion further signifies that the ultimate seat of decision regarding the action of those who are invaded lies not with them but with the invaders. And when the power of decision is located outside, rather than within the one who should decide, the latter has only the illusion of deciding, end quote. Exactly how do they do this? How do they invade a culture? Here's a quote from page 141 that talks about that. Quote, cultural conquest leads to the cultural inauthenticity of those who are invaded. They begin to respond to the values, the standards, and the goals of the invaders. In their passion to dominate, to mold others to their patterns and their way of life, the invaders desire to know how those they have invaded apprehend reality, but only so they can dominate the latter more effectively. In cultural invasion, it is essential that those who are invaded come to see their reality with the outlook of the invaders rather than their own. For the more they mimic the invaders, the more stable the position of the latter becomes. End quote. It's from page 141. Okay, so I know those were some long quotes, so let's unpack that a little bit. The basic premise of cultural invasion in education is that kids might come into education with some preconceived ideas of what they want to learn and what they want to get out of schooling. If we view that as a culture or as interests or however we want to describe it, school itself and the pedagogies that we use in it can act as a form of invasion on those ways of knowing and being and thinking. So as an example in computer science, if a student comes into a class and really wants to learn how to be a game developer, like that is something they value highly, they love playing video games like I do, they love creating them, they love designing levels, creating mechanics, etc. But instead, the computer science class only focuses on other ways of engaging in computer science or coding. This could be a form of cultural invasion. It is saying, yes, we know that you value this thing, and this is something that you are a part of, and that you value, and that you love, and want to learn more about. However, we think you need to learn all these other things. While I certainly see a lot of benefit and have experienced learning topics that I didn't realize I was going to be very passionate about, Freire would argue that this is still a form of cultural invasion, despite how well-intentioned it is. By saying, this is how you engage in computer science and coding, and this is what we expect you to learn and work on, it is a form of cultural invasion or epistemological or ontological colonization. In other words, colonizing the ways of knowing and being a computer scientist or a programmer. One of the ways that oppressors ensure this approach succeeds is by convincing the oppressed that their culture is intrinsically inferior compared to the culture of the dominating culture. So going back to the example that I just gave, it would be saying, well, yeah, I know you want to learn how to program games and design them, but that's not as important as learning about networks and databases and other topics that are outside of gaming and game design, etc. Now, building off of that, Freire notes that an unsaid role of schooling is to prepare future invaders by perpetuating the myth that the dominant culture is superior to the culture of the oppressed. So all this being said, these anti-dialogical practices that Freire is talking about, the conquest, divide and conquer, manipulation, and cultural invasion, educators who reflect on these things and think back on how they were taught and how they are currently teaching might come to a realization that they are unintentionally engaging in oppressive practices. This can create a cognitive dissonance with the teachers, because it's like, well, this really worked well for me and I learned all these things and like I enjoyed school, so I became an educator. So is it really hurting kids all that much, etc.? Here's a particular quote that will relate to this. So this is from page 144. Quote, well-intentioned professionals, those who use invasion not as a deliberate ideology, but as the expression of their own upbringing, eventually discover that certain of their educational failures must be ascribed, not to the intrinsic inferiority of the simple men of the people, but to the violence of their own act of invasion. Those who make this discovery face a difficult alternative. They feel the need to renounce invasion, but patterns of domination are so entrenched within them that this renunciation would become a threat to their own identities. To renounce invasion would mean ending their dual status as dominated and dominators. It would mean abandoning all the myths which nourish invasion and starting to incarnate dialogical action. Now, this form of socialization, of learning through people who are oppressing future educators, who then become educators and end up unknowingly oppress others, this kind of socialization impacts everyone. So here's a quote from page 144 to 146. Quote, "Professional women and men of any specialty, university graduates or not, are individuals who have been determined from above by a culture of domination which has constituted them as dual beings. If they had come from lower classes, this miseducation would be the same, if not worse." End quote. So in other words, this happens to everybody. So me reading this stuff about domination and anti-dialogical practices, this isn't me saying, hey, you person who's listening, you're doing this horrible thing, you need to wise up. This is everybody, myself, Freire, everybody who's ever existed, who is engaging in some kind of socialization that can relate to oppression and the oppressed, according to Freire at least. Now, to prevent this from happening, Freire recommends engaging in permanent dialogue between leaders and people. That way, people are able to continue critical reflection and action, which makes it harder for this kind of cultural invasion to occur. So before I talk about how to combat these anti-dialogical practices, let's talk about what Freire mentions as leaders, which for the purposes of this podcast, we could think of leaders as CS educators, researchers, etc. So Freire suggests that leaders typically belong to the oppressing class in one way or another, and at some point they renounce their position with such a class and join the people. So to do this, quote, "The people must find themselves in the emerging leaders, and the latter must find themselves in the people," end quote, from page 150. So how a leader presents or aligns themselves to the cause may present a leader and people as a contradiction to the oppressors, or it may position them in a triangular relationship with the oppressors and the oppressed. So in other words, as a CS educator, depending on how you position yourself, you might position yourself with those who are oppressed, like students, or you might position yourself as an outsider to both the oppressors and the oppressed. The one way you could potentially think of that is students being one point on a triangle, yourself being on another point on a triangle, and maybe like administrators or policies or standards being the third point on the triangle. Freire, however, recommends that educators not position themselves within that triangular approach. Instead, he recommends aligning with the people who are oppressed, in this case, likely the students that you're thinking of right now. So as an example of how you can align yourself, think of the conversations from the discussion on chapter 2 on the teacher-student and the student-teacher, or other conversations I've had on facilitating. This kind of positioning of a teacher-student means that you are able to learn alongside and with the kids that you work with. However, you are still in a leadership position. So as an example of that, when I talk about facilitating in some of the interviews that I've done in previous episodes, I mentioned that I am constantly trying to learn alongside with and from the kids that I work with. But ultimately, I was the one who had to assign the grade, and I was the one who had final say on the design of the class. Even though kids had input in it, I still was the leader within that particular space or context. But again, even though I was trying not to, I could argue that many of the practices that we ended up engaging in were forms of oppression. Now, to build off of that, if teachers are leaders within a space, what distinguishes them from the oppressor? Quote, "What distinguishes revolutionary leaders from the dominant elite is not only their objectives, but their procedures. If they act in the same way, the objectives become identical. It is as self-contradictory for the dominant elites to pose human world relations as problems to the people as it is for the revolutionary leaders not to do so." End quote. This is from pages 153 to 154. So again, building off of the conversation on chapter 2 and chapter 3, leaders need to engage in dialogue with the kids that they're working with. And Freire recommends engaging in a problem-posing approach to education that I've talked about in the other episodes in this little mini-series. Okay, now to combat the anti-dialogical practices, Freire has 4 main ways of engaging in dialogical practices. So one is cooperation. The second one is unity for liberation. The third one is organization. And the fourth characteristic is cultural synthesis. So let's unpack each of these at the close of this particular chapter. So cooperation. So building off the question of when are teachers leaders and when are they oppressors, teachers are leaders through cooperation. Quote, leaders, in spite of their important, fundamental, and indispensable role, do not own the people and have no right to steer the people blindly towards their salvation, end quote, page 154. So the kinds of transformations that have been discussed since the very first episode on this miniseries is done through dialogue and cooperation. Through this cooperation, people need to uncover the forms of oppression on their own through critical reflection and dialogue, which result in some kind of an action, rather than having leaders do the work for the oppressed or on their own. So what I talked about in the episode 2 weeks ago for chapter 3, it is not simply enough to make assumptions about how students perceive they are being oppressed. As the example I gave, the robotics course, the example that I gave is assuming that students who don't have a robotics course would really want that. We need to actually engage in dialogue and cooperate with kids to learn from them to figure out what it is they actually want. For example, the one that I mentioned 2 weeks ago, maybe instead they want a game design class. Okay, so the next characteristic, unity for liberation. So anti-dialogical practices seek division, whereas dialogical practices seek unity for liberation. So in other words, synthesizing discussions from previous chapters, the entire point of dialogical practices is to unify for and through liberation. It is not to flip it so that now the oppressed are the oppressors. It is to unify and continue to engage in permanent critical reflection and action that seeks transformation, to humanize society, a group, etc. So the third characteristic on organization. So in order to actually unify people, leaders need to assist with organizing people around the common task of the struggle for liberation. So Freire suggests organization should occur around the consistency of words and actions. So the boldness to confront risks, increase action, encouraging love through the liberation of humankind rather than demonizing oppressors. So some considerations around organization include thinking about the consistency between words and actions when you're organizing and communicating, the overall boldness to confront risks, increasing action, encouraging love through liberation of humankind rather than demonizing oppressors, and having faith in people. Now, an important note is that revolutionary leaders also need to organize themselves with the people, not just among other leaders. So this is one of the many reasons why I actually don't refer to myself as Dr. O'Leary, and why you will often see me presenting at conferences like international conferences while wearing the same clothing that I would wear in the classroom or at the grocery store. So like jeans and a shirt. One of the reasons why I do this is I want to align myself with the people I went into education for, rather than separate myself as being an outsider sitting on some kind of an ivory tower in academia. Now, that being said, some people will view my attire and resistance to my title as being unprofessional or uncaring. However, I would argue that's perpetuating a form of oppression, where some ways of being are intended to speak on the behalf of other educators and students rather than with educators or students. So, as a more concrete example of this, if you happen to go to a research-heavy conference, you'll notice a lot of people walking around in suits. Whereas if you go to the practitioner-heavy conferences, you'll notice a lot of people will walk around in shorts, t-shirts, things like that. A question that I have for that kind of contrast is, what does that say about the kinds of people who can engage in and discuss research? In my opinion, equating professionalism to wearing expensive forms of attire and going by titles such as Dr. blah 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 are forms of separating yourself from practitioners. It's also a form of separating yourself from lower socioeconomic status. So I don't wear a suit when I go to those presentations, and I certainly stand out. So my question for listeners is, whose narratives are being forwarded when we have a definition of what is considered to be, quote, professional dress or attire? Why are we trying to look like politicians or business executives when we attend conferences? Why are we trying to look like we work in an office when we are helping kids? There's no right or wrong answer to this, just kind of posing it as something to think through. So my larger point is that if we are going to be organizing ourselves as leaders, we need to make sure that we organize ourselves with the communities, with the kids, with the parents, etc., that we are trying to assist through liberatory and critical pedagogical practices. Okay, so I'll end my rant right there. All right, so the last section on this particular book and in this chapter is on cultural synthesis. So this is the last characteristic of dialogical practices. Quote, in cultural synthesis, the actors who come from another world to the world of the people do so not as invaders. They do not come to teach or to transmit or to give anything, but rather to learn with the people about the people's world. End quote. That's from page 165. So when I went into education, I went into it, as I've mentioned previously, because I wanted to help other people. I was suicidal in high school and much of my undergrad, and the music practices that I was engaging in literally kept me alive. So when I went into education, I wanted to do something similar. I wanted to give to others what had really helped me out significantly. What I quickly realized is that not everyone is going to need that kind of support through that kind of subject area in that kind of a way. And I eventually started to broaden out my horizons to start exploring computer science and other subject areas and their intersections and whatnot. When I went back into the classroom after finishing all my coursework for my doctorate, I realized that I took an approach that heavily aligned with what Freire is describing as cultural synthesis. So I was trying to learn with students and learn about the things they are interested in and how they could explore those interests through computer science and through coding. So rather than going into a CS class or a coding class and saying, here's my view of reality and I'm going to transmit my view to you, it instead is about exploring students' relationships with computer science, with coding, with the world, how those all interact in different ways. And this, again, builds off of the ideas of like culturally relevant pedagogy and interest-driven learning and whatnot that I've talked about in several other episodes. All right, so as with every other Unpacking Scholarship episode, I'm going to now kind of share some of my lingering questions and thoughts after having read this particular chapter, as well as some of my overall thoughts after having read the entire book. So one of my biggest questions is that I have intentionally saved until this final podcast is, why doesn't the author provide more evidence to support their claims? So although some of the chapters, like chapters 3 and 4, have some evidence to back up their claims, the book reads more of as an op-ed piece that I agree with, but it lacks citations to multiple verifiable acts and events that ground the conversation in something we can analyze, deconstruct, critique, etc. Now, to clarify, I'm not taking a positivist view to say that theory without application or a context to deconstruct something is meaningless. What I am saying is that it's important to note that although the book was written with experiences by the author that could justify these claims, the way the book is written makes it so that we have to take the author's word for what is said without being able to verify by looking at other independent publications or events that also verify the claims. Now, that being said, there are people who have used this book as a framework for understanding other forms of oppression. So these works do exist, and this pedagogy is helpful for understanding forms of oppression. I just, again, point this out because I think it's important to be critical of things that we even agree with. Otherwise, we can end up following without questioning, which, again, hence why I ask questions at the end of each one of these podcast episodes that unpack scholarship. Okay, now another thing that I've been teasing for a while and kind of talked about in some of the interviews that I've previously done is I'd argue that mandatory subject areas such as computer science is actually a form of oppression in terms of forcing a narrative that positions one reality over others. So as an example that I previously mentioned, standards encourage engagement through certain sets of concepts, practices, skills, etc. that are related to computer science. However, anytime you're creating any kind of a standard, you're going to have to leave some practices, concepts, etc. out. So the kinds of engagement with computer science that are not forwarded through standards may unintentionally be viewed as unimportant. That being said, if we go back to my original point of mandatory subject areas, the kind of subject areas that are elective are deemed as not important compared to other areas that are, quote, the core subject areas. If we keep diving down the road of adding more core subject areas that are mandated for everybody, that approach, without adding more hours to the school day, is going to dilute every other subject area in terms of how far you can dive deep into those other subjects. So, for example, if read and write and arithmetic are our three main subject areas, and then we add in computer science, that takes away from time on read and write and arithmetic, which, frankly, I'm okay with. But if we keep going down this path and say, okay, well, now PE or physical education is mandatory, okay, and now music is mandatory, and now art is mandatory, and foreign language is mandatory, etc. Now we have like a dozen or so classes throughout the day that are mandatory that are considered core subjects. This then dilutes what we can actually do with it and actually accomplish by engaging in those subject areas. But again, this is a form of oppression because it forwards certain ways of knowing and engaging in content, while also positioning others as irrelevant or not as important by making them elective. Now, another larger thing that kept popping up in my mind while reading through this book was the notion of oppression of gender in relation to STEM, tech, computer science fields, etc. So on one hand, there is a large diversity issue going on in STEM, tech, computer science, STEAM, in terms of it's mainly white and Asian males who are engaging in a lot of those professions. So we're trying to diversify it, whether it be based on gender or race or sexuality or however you want, whatever demographic you want to go with. We're trying to balance things out a little bit more. That's great. I totally support this. I don't think it should be heavily swayed in one direction or demographic more than another. That's just a little weird. But I do question, well, why is that? Why is there this imbalance in some demographics, in some professions, and not in others? And when it comes to this lack of representation within these fields, this can create some problems in terms of creating silent forms of oppression, where it's saying these are the certain kinds of people who will be successful or can engage in these kinds of careers. So that is a form of oppression, and it is typically a silent one. One of the things that I find interesting as a non-binary individual is that we have several CS organizations that are dedicated to getting more women and girls interested in computer science. We also have lots of publications and presentations on this particular topic, but we don't have the same movement or public outcry for elementary teachers, where more than 80% of the elementary teachers are women and white. So this is an example of focusing on one form of dominance in CS as a field, while ignoring others in elementary education as a field. So my question is, why is it unacceptable that there are so few women in STEM, CS, tech, etc., but we don't complain that there are so few men in elementary education? So to me, this is a selective view of oppression that we, as a field, need to actually reconcile with. We can't just go with the dominative narrative that we need to get more women in CS professions. Yeah, I agree with you. But if we view that as a problem, then we also need to engage in a conversation about the demographic imbalances that exist within educators in the field of education. And why do organizations that are trying to help marginalized genders, such as women, in some fields like STEM, STEAM, CS, tech, etc., why don't they also mention that gender is not a binary, and that there are individuals who exist outside of that false binary, like myself and other guests who have been on the show? Okay, so I'm going to end rant there. I hope you enjoyed this mini-series on Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It is a dense book if you're not used to reading that kind of content. You've probably noticed from all the quotes that I was reading. However, it's the kind of book that I highly recommend anyone read if you want to learn more about liberatory practices in education. And given everything that's been going on in 2020, it seems like a lot of people are wanting to learn about these forms of pedagogy. So I think this is an excellent book to dive deeper into. Hopefully this podcast serves as a little introduction or teaser that'll encourage you to read the book. Stay tuned next week for another interview, and then the following week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode that will talk about something other than Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I hope you enjoyed this mini-series, and I hope you're having a wonderful and safe week. Thank you so much for listening.